All right, thanks again, everyone. We'll be getting started in just another minute. All right, so it looks like we should get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the latest installment of the S.T.O.P RadTech speaker series. Really excited for today's conversation on the intersection of defunding the police and surveillance. My name is Albert Fox Cahn, and I'm the executive director of S.T.O.P, the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. We're a New York-based privacy and civil rights organization, and we bring you these monthly conversations in partnership with RadTech, a meetup devoted to exploring the interesting ideas at the intersection of technology, policing, public interest, and so much else. So for tonight's conversation, I'm joined by really just one of the most amazing voices in this space. Sidney Fussell is a reporter based in San Francisco, covering technology for Wired. Previously, he was a staff writer at The Atlantic, and he writes about surveillance, the economy, social impacts of AI, and of course the COVID-19 crisis. And we've worked together on a number of stories, and he really often brings some of the most insightful analysis and writing in the field. So lucky to have you, Sidney. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really excited about tonight.
Of course. So why don't we start off with an easy question? So how do you think defunding the police impacts surveillance? Not much to unpack there. No, but seriously, at a high level, when you think about the current calls to defund the police, how good, bad, how does that reverberate in the police surveillance ecosystem?
Yeah, I definitely think that, looking at police technology from 2015 to now, the rhetoric has definitely stayed the same. There's always been an emphasis on cost saving measures. There's always been an emphasis on, implementing new surveillance technology may seem expensive. And we see very big budget tags, attached to things like body cameras or CCTV, but it's always pitched as this will save you money in the long run because crime will decrease. And that same claim hasn't changed, but that import has really increased as the defund movement started. And so you end up with this very odd situation where a lot of police technology companies are in a weird way sort of like dipping their toe into almost supporting defunding just because they can say, hey, if you buy body cameras, crime will decrease and misconduct complaints will decrease. Or, hey, if you invest in, sort of aerial surveillance drones, there'll be less crimes. And also, it'll take fewer labor hours, so you'll save on overtime. So a lot's happened over the past year, but I would say the number one oddest thing has been seeing these police technology companies, these police technology startups in a weird way sort of mimicking or appropriating some of the defund talking points and just how they're selling the tech. And so it's crazy because defund is immediately was seen as like a radical leftist, talking point, but it's like anything else, is very malleable. And, capitalism always finds a way. It always finds some way to do it. And so we've seen these startups mimic that and even, try to reach out to different orgs to sort of launder that message. And so that's been, in a year of very strange things, that's just been like one more strange thing.
And I really do think if there's any one constant theme to Silicon Valley messaging, it's that whatever your problem is, we will find a way to explain why our tech is the solution. And I feel like this is no different. And you've done some great work looking at Camden, New Jersey in particular. Could you give us a bit of background? Why was there originally a call to, systemically reform or defund or even abolish the police in Camden?
Right. So earlier this year when defund really took off, There was a lot of emphasis on Camden, New Jersey for defunding the police. And so there's like two things to know about this. And the number one most important thing to know about this is that defunding the police in Camden was very, very, very unpopular among residents. It was not a sort of like what we think of now in terms of grassroots leftist organizers. People who lived in the city did not want this. This was coming from the top down. This is coming from Governor Christie, if you're familiar. This was coming from the mayor. This is coming from government officials. And so as with anything with relating to police surveillance and police technology, you have to look at the sort of like social context. And so the main thing to know about Camden is that the city of Camden, New Jersey relies a lot on state funds. I think something like 60% of the buildings in Camden, New Jersey are exempt from property taxes. So in terms of like where taxes are going, Camden is a city that takes in a lot of state funding. So state officials like the governor were very, very interested in what can we do to get costs down in Camden. And so one of the ideas that they came up with was as crime had increased in Camden, they had also increased the size of the police force. And so they came up with this idea of, well, let's disband the police force, restart it, we'll save a lot of money. And residents were, understandably horrified. Crime was not decreasing, the murder rate was not decreasing, and then you have the governor coming in and saying, well, let's get rid of the police department. So it was very unpopular. So let's just like start with there. And then the second part of this is when they actually did, they did exactly what it sounds like. They disbanded the police department, they fired all the police officers, and any police officer that wanted to continue working in Camden had to reapply after undergoing new training. But they were brought in as county employees as opposed to city employees. And that saved the city of Camden an estimated $80,000 to $90,000 per officer because they came in with reduced benefits, reduced salary, with a lot of new rules around overtime. So the main thing to think of this is that this was a top-down cost-cutting measure that was not about crime, was not about safety, was not about, populist leftist talking points. It was purely about wanting to save money. That's where we began with. And so, Scott Thompson, the former PD commissioner at the time, has said a lot about how this was a success story because crime decreased. And yes, it's true. Crime did decrease, violent crime, decreased about 40% between then and now, but there was a huge upscale in, keyword surveillance. There's a lot more cameras. There's a lot more punishment for sort of like smaller crimes. There was a lot more interest in, body cameras and things like that. And so when you look at Camden, it's not as clear cut, I think, as it was presented in terms of, oh, we disbanded police and everything got better. There's a lot of complicated factors, but I think the two things we need to talk about is just number one, what did residents want? And number two, that this was about money and this wasn't about safety or security or even community support. Residents didn't support it. And I think that those are things that we tend to, looking at Minneapolis, we tend to say like, oh, these, radical leftists are trying to change communities. And it's often not about that. It's about money first and foremost.
And it's so bizarre. First of all, it's bizarre to think of Christie, of all people, championing abolishing the police, given everything he says.
Noted leftist Christie, yes.
Yeah, I just can see him out there, picture him right now with a protest sign and everything. No, but it's so strange because this is so different from the sort of picture that I typically see of Camden, like in the national discussion. Do you think is this just my perception, or are people systematically getting this story wrong, like how it unfolded and what the impact is?
I think that there were people who were invested in presenting the story of Camden as being what you're describing. I think a lot of people that were in, the original police department, and then it's called Camden Metro now, it's new police department, I think there was a lot of investment in that talking point and in that image, but when, in talking to people that live there, it was very different. And I think it's different in some ways and some in other ways. One of the ways it's different is just what we were talking about before. One of the ways it is similar is just a huge lack of investment in the city. So there was a lot of investment in bringing in new business and tax breaks for people who wanted to bring new buildings in and things like that. But there wasn't a lot of investment in, like things like housing and things like prevention. There's not a lot of investment in treatment, things like that. The things that we want that actually like would help a city that's going through things like that. But I would say that the biggest through line between Camden and other cities that have high crime rates where surveillance is being seen as like a solution is just a lack of investment in the city itself, and instead are turning towards cost-saving measures. This idea that we can just remove people, essentially. When you think about the point of police technology is to reduce the amount of labor you get from police officers and increase, the number of criminals you arrest, which is essentially a removal system. You're getting rid of the bad guys, putting them somewhere else, and you're spending less money on officers. So I think if we frame all of this in terms of income, like money, in terms of like profit, revenue, the amount of money being spent in these municipal budgets, it all makes a little bit sense. It all becomes a little bit more congruent, even though there are these differences. That's what it comes down to.
Interesting. And so, as an example, is Camden purely a cautionary tale? Are there aspects of it that offer any redeeming elements when you think about the potential of more systematically defunding police and refunding communities? Or is it just something that's dressed up in the language of defund, but really nothing the same?
I mean, I'm not a resident, so I wouldn't want to speak for anyone there, but in talking to residents, it sort of seems like people were left wanting more. And there's been, I will say, the more you delve into it, the more complicated it gets. But I don't think that any resident wants either more surveillance or police presence. They want to live in a place where neither is required based on the conditions. They just want to be able to walk outside with their kids like you and I or anyone else. And so you end up in these odd situations where you can find people who are super pro this new system because it means more police officers or more surveillance cameras, or people that are pro, whatever the combination is. But at the end of the day, people there want the same things people anywhere else want. So I think it's possible to find people who agree with the new system, and more power to them. I'm happy that they're happy with it. But I think that fundamentally, when you think about people just wanting safety and security and to feel invested and feel like their leaders care about them, I don't know that this is the best way to get that for everyone and not just a few people at a time.
Definitely. And I just wanted to invite everyone in the audience to add your questions to the queue. We have a few already, but we really want to make sure that we're hitting the topics that are most relevant and most concerning to you. So you mentioned a few of the surveillance tools that were deployed in Camden, and some of them sound very familiar. Were there any surveillance systems that you think are particularly distinctive there, either technologies that hadn't gained widespread deployment elsewhere that you saw being used there, or tools that were being used in different ways? I'm just trying to get a sense to what extent is Camden just showcasing what the sort of surveillance we already have, or is it showing something that goes much further?
I mean, I didn't see any type of surveillance in Camden that you wouldn't see elsewhere. I think what is really interesting is that not too long after they changed police departments, they set up a real-time crime center, which is, it looks like the Matrix. It's all these TVs. It's just basically, just imagine like a small room with TVs everywhere, and each TV is connected to a system of surveillance cameras somewhere in the city. So, one person could sit down in this center and see surveillance footage, real-time surveillance footage from all over this city. And Obama actually visited late 2014, early 2015, and that was really sort of seen as sort of like a stamp of approval almost for surveillance as a replacement. Obviously that was shortly before Black Lives Matter started in earnest, but this idea that we can reduce police presence, make people feel less threatened on the ground, but still have our eyes on them in case something happens, that really, really seemed to be endorsed simply by him being there. And the fact that, at the time, Obama was seen as this, hardened leftist liberal that sort of became seen as like, oh, this is something to go for. And then, if I can be critical of Obama, one of the things that he was often criticized about was not just real-time surveillance centers, but also there was like I think the DOJ spent $60 million on body cameras over the 4 years. So like there was a real him visiting Cameron, the real-time crime center, was really sort of seen as the beginning of the sort of like the Obama administration's real investment in surveillance as sort of the middle ground between, you know, conservatives who are very much opposed to any type of reform, and then like activists and protesters who are very and you know, who really wanted something more radical. So like that really became sort of like his tactic was, okay, DOJ grants for surveillance centers, for roving vans, for body cameras. And 4 years later, I don't know that we've seen spectacular results, but certainly at the time that was sort of seen as his like trademark.
Yeah, Loretta Lynch rolled out that body cam program in 2014, and it was designed as a police accountability tool. It's a way to reduce incidents of police violence, as a way to reduce what they claimed were unfounded complaints against officers. There was some great work done in DC on this, where they examined whether or not there was actually any benefits to the body cams. And you know, one of the best sort of you know, control sample based sort of studies I've seen, they didn't really find any meaningful impact on any.
If I could just jump in, whenever people talk about body cameras, I always, you know, they've fallen off, the battery's been deactivated, the footage has gotten lost, the dog eats it, the tooth fairy, whatever. But there's like one very specific example of a body camera working in the sense in which it was intended, in which I always bring this up, which is in, you know, Axon is a body camera maker, and they have this feature called pre-record, which basically means that when you press the record button, it actually saves the 30 seconds before you hit record. So it's an always on camera that saves 30 seconds before record and then everything after. And so in Baltimore, 2 police officers were planting evidence. They found, I think it was like weed or cocaine or something like that. They placed it in a little soup can in this guy's backyard, and they turned on the camera to find it. So of course, when the public defender like looks at this footage, he gets the entire thing. He gets to see the police officer taking this out of evidence, putting it in the can, putting it down, pressing record, and saying like, "Whoa, I just found this. That's crazy. Let's lock this guy up." And then that police officer was, you know, obviously those charges were dropped, and it led to like lots of charges being dropped, because who knows how long this has been going on. I highly doubt that was the one and only example of any police officer ever doing that. But whenever people talk about like, do body cameras work? I was like, that is what it means for body camera to work. The point of those cameras was police accountability, transparency, catching misconduct. And so it's so rare to have concrete examples of that working in that way, but that is one way in which it did work. Very rare, but yeah.
No, I mean, and I do love that footage. Like, I've never had so much schadenfreude in my life as watching that footage of the guy oblivious to the fact that he recorded himself committing a felony and planting evidence. But I mean, the problem is that the officers are the ones who get to control when it's recording, what the angle it's recorded from. Their perspective is privileged. It's always showing the world from their viewpoint. And it's all these things that, you know, prime it to become a, you know, weapon of mass surveillance much more than a police accountability tool. And we already see Wolfcom and others offering, you know, live facial recognition through police body cameras and really just upending their stated purpose.
I mean, that really sort of shows you the dangers of technology, and that, you know, you can set an ordinance that says, oh, well, we have to approve, or there needs to be public comment on any new technology for, let's say, 2 years. But over those 24 months, the technology could evolve in like all these unpredictable, you know, really, really intense ways. So the fact that it's like, it accumulates new concerns that you may not have known about, or certainly didn't have the time to educate the public about during, you know, like a 30-day public comment phase or something like that. And so, you know, borrowing a lot from feminist scholars in this idea of like fluid consent or ongoing consent, I really think we need to think more, just think more broadly about what it means to consent to these devices, considering the fact that like one day it's a camera, then you add like new types of like audio capabilities, and then you add automated redaction, and then you add object recognition, and you add facial recognition. If this all happens within the 2 years or whatever that you said you wanted it, it's like, what you end up with is not what you signed on for. And it's really, really difficult to educate people or to legislate the technology itself at the pace at which it's changing.
Yeah, my frequent co-author Evan Selinger has written a lot of great stuff on the non-fallacious slippery slope, and how when you're dealing with surveillance, if once you've paid for the hardware, that's the vast majority of the cost, and so it becomes so cheap to then add all of these extra layers of tracking on top of it, and it becomes and so we often hear about slippery slope arguments being a bad thing, but when it's that easy to go, it's so cheap to go from just a CCTV camera system to a facial recognition camera system. All it takes is a little bit of software.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we're starting to see people just realize, wait, wait a minute, what's going on, what's possible. And then this totally like ties into the defund conversation, that it's like, we're spending how much money on what? Like there's a certain degree of just sort of like waking up or just like shock when you realize what these tools can do, how many there are, and then also how connected they are. So, like there's a big push right now on police technology to make sure that, the license plate reading camera, the drone, the body camera, and the CCTV and the ring footage are all, coming together, and that that police departments and law enforcement agencies can easily synthesize these very different data sources and make them talk to each other. And so it's not just one thing does different things over time. It's that multiple things all doing different things over time, and now we're all putting them together, and this data is being synthesized in all these different ways, and it requires a lot more than just 20-day comment or something like that to understand what's going on.
Yeah, every time you add a new layer to the data collection, you're expanding the danger exponentially, and so it's sort of analogous to what we always heard of as the mosaic theory of national security intelligence gathering in the Bush administration. It's become the norm with a lot of policing. But one thing I wanted to circle back to, you highlighted the fact that with Camden, the effort to quote defund there was coming top down. It was coming from Christie. But right now we see this amazing community driven activism all around the country trying to push to defund at the local level. What are the ways that you think that communities can actually be more centered in that conversation?
I mean, I'd start off by saying I didn't even know, before this conversation started, I didn't even know that you could look up police budgets, and it's usually just a Google away. So I highly recommend anyone, wherever you are, type in city and then municipal city police budget or something like that. And like, it'll take a couple tries, but eventually you will find your own police budget. And so I live in San Francisco now because I report in technology, but I'm from the South. I'm from Arkansas, not a super lefty state, but I was in a lot of very heated discussions about defund police when I go back to my home state. And so I always say, when anyone has any opinion about defund, I always say, have you looked at the police budget? How much is the police budget? How much do we spend on it? What is that number? Because I think that that really is, for me, that's like the door to the conversation. So anyone listening, however you feel about defund police, how much does your city or your municipality spend on police? If you don't know that, hold off on it, tell that person to wait, go figure it out, come back. And that's, I think, is the number one thing, is that this data is publicly available. You can go out and get it, and you should know that number. And then from there, it's like, well, what are they spending it on? It gets a little bit more complicated, but I think that just public access is number one. And I think that, if you're lucky enough to be in a place where, either university or nonprofit or an organization is synthesizing a 300-page city budget, it's not going to be the most thrilling, but if anyone can help you through it, or if there's an org out there that is summarizing it for people, even better. Knowledge is power. So I would say, number one, attain knowledge about what's being used. And number two, if you go in, usually a lot of police budgets will actually section off how the money is spent. So like the number one question about defunding police is, well, what about murders and what about rapes? What about violent crimes? And like most city budgets, they'll actually tell you from the last year how much money they spent on those crimes in terms of like either trying to clear them, in terms of like arresting people in connection with them, or the price of those investigations. So I would say, just number one, yes, no one's saying that the murderers run around like it's a playground, but you can actually get a concrete number that how much money does it cost, according to the police, to pursue murder crimes, to pursue homicides, to pursue sexual assaults. And I think that like finding concrete numbers is a real antidote to the type of hysteria that happens during these conversations. And, again, like I grew up in an area where I was around police a lot. I grew up in an area with a lot of gang violence. So I saw police a lot. I interacted with police a lot. They were in my life. They were not foreign to me. But I found that a lot of people who have very strong opinions about the defund the police discourse don't interact with police a lot. And I'm just curious what experiences they're drawing from when they defend police or when they argue against rethinking the ways we can spend those funds, because I think that we should, to your point about serving the community, the people who interact with the police should be at the table and should be talking about this, and their voices need to be heard. So I would say that was like a real shock to me, that people who don't even interact with the police, like, have you ever called 911 before? And it's like, oh, no, not really, and it was like, well, then why is this so, you know what I mean? And so I think that like, there's just a high degree of like distance from police, and therefore distance from the consequences of policing, that is making this conversation just a little bit more abstract than it needs to be. And the antidote to that is in these huge, boring PDFs that really break it down exactly how much is being spent. And then from there, you can have a conversation about what you think is a reasonable amount to be spent. I personally think it's unreasonable to spend more on policing than on education. Personally, but I also like I have some numbers in my head about like what makes more sense to me. So just like as a step one, I would say look at some numbers and don't just rely on Law and Order or SVU or something like that.
No, but I was about to bring that up because I honestly think that if people spend as much time watching, actual trials and actual arraignments and actual and like digging into the realities of policing rather than these, stupid cop shows, which are easy to, produce and are profitable, it would fundamentally remake a lot of the discourse, because we're legislating based on a fantasy of policing.
I agree with that wholeheartedly.
Although I will say there's a bit of a caveat to your rule about people should look up the budget of the police departments in their state. If you're in New York, you have my sympathy if you try to make sense of it, because up until recently, we had a lovely provision which allowed the NYPD to hold back tens of millions of dollars in funding from public analysis. That was called the Special Expenditures Fund. It was just scrapped by Comptroller Scott Stringer, but because of that, because of the multi-million-dollar NYPD Foundation, which gets private funding and federal grants, and all of these opaque funding sources, even someone like me who spends my entire day job focused on policing, I don't know how much the NYPD truly gets, and that I think speaks to the lack of democratic oversight that we have in a city like New York.
Absolutely. There's a lot of secrecy, but you have to, it's weird because you're disincentivized from even discovering the secrecy. So it's like you have to first go looking for this information, and then you realize, oh, well, why isn't this here? Or like, a lot of places, like civil forfeitures or, things like that, where it's like they like seize funds or things like that. So I just saw on Forbes that those increased during recessions and during municipal cuts, shockingly. But at the same time, that may or may not be reported in your police budget. So it's like, even if you defund police, there may be like other ways from getting this money. So like it gets very complicated very quickly. I think my frustration though is that we don't even get far enough in the conversation for it to even get complicated. Like we stop at the simple, like the very simple, like, well, how much should they even spend? Like we stop at step one before we even get to the complicated stuff. And so, like I have so much respect for the organizers and, organizers, researchers, activists, just people talking to their parents, like everyone just trying to like drag us at least to like a minimally informed base for this discussion.
Yeah, and I one thing that I'm thinking about is there's so many different techniques and tactics and accountability campaigns that we've seen. Is there something that you look at and you think it's a particularly good model of sort of civilian accountability in this space when it comes to policing budgets, policing tactics, police surveillance, any of it?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many great orgs out there. S.T.O.P, if you're familiar, Uptrust, ACLU. Like, there's a lot of great orgs that are doing this type of work, but they tend to be in the bigger places. And so, like, again, being from a smaller town, I'm from a smaller town. Like, if you're from a smaller place, like, there's a lot of accountability work that there's not the resources for. There aren't people doing it. So I mean, I always recommend that people can be their own best advocate, just in like asking those basic questions. It's sort of like going two directions at once, but at the same time, the fact that all these different city council meetings and budget meetings are on Zoom makes it both easier and more difficult to access them. Like certainly, like all you have to do is like log in and watch it, but also it's like really, really hard to sustain in like intense motions, like the passion that you need to maintain a movement. It's kind of hard to do that over Zoom. Like Zoom tends to like not, like thrill people the way it should. But I do think that like anyone can try to take advantage of the always onlineness of this moment to, be in, if the public square is online and we all have some way of getting online, then we all have some way of like hopefully jumping into the public square in some way and having those types of discussions. And it's going to be very regionally specific. Like I know where I'm from in Arkansas, there's not a lot of support for this. There's a lot of support for the opposite of this, but that doesn't mean that there aren't people out there who are like at least trying to educate people or learn more about it. And I think that the fact that we had such a strong reaction to this means that this will be a sustained conversation going post-Trump, into Biden. Like, I think that this will be a sustained conversation, the way that you'll be able to find those people and build those bridges and hopefully build on top of them.
Yeah, and at the risk of sounding a bit too wonky, like if you got to just, wave a wand and like change some of the ways that these choices are made, would it be improving like transparency and freedom of information act stuff? Would it be having like a civilian oversight board like in Oakland? Would it be having other sort of legislative stuff? I'm just wondering if there's any of those sorts of structures that you think are particularly helpful, or maybe they're just all helpful.
They're all helpful. I do think that like being open about the amount, like I remember being shocked by how much money NYPD spends on misconduct settlements. And I remember seeing, I think it was a New York Post, it was a story that was like, oh, Black Lives Matter protesters caused $50,000 in damages during a protest. And I was just like, okay, but like how much are we spending on these settlements? Like, it's like, if we could just get a sense of scale, you know what I mean? Because it's like $50,000 seems like a lot of money, but next to the amount of money that's spent on settlements for the abuses that caused the protests, like I feel like if we just get a sense of scale and connection, it would really change everything, because you can throw out big numbers like, oh, $40,000 charges or whatever, and it shocks people and it becomes just like fuel for a lot of bad faith arguments. But yeah, definitely transparency around finances. And also, just like this word defund, I think really, really startles people, but like taking defund and putting it in other lenses. So like if you think about, a city that is rerouting funds from schools to build new prisons, which is something that happens quite frequently in the South, is that not a form of defunding? Like I think people were so horrified by just like that one specific verb that they don't realize it's been happening all of their lives. And so I think that like a reframing, not an Obama style reframing, but just like an understanding that this idea of like taking funds from this to put in something else has already been happening, but it's generally been happening away from social services, away from welfare, away from stamp, away from SNAP, away from, you know what I mean, away from those things into like more punitive measures, and realizing this has already been happening. I think will help people not feel so just repulsed and like stunned by this idea. Like it's already happening, happens all the time, just in a different direction.
Yeah, I mean, the really radical transformation was the decades-long increase in mass incarceration and just the expansion of policing. It's really remarkable when you compare it to any other country, basically.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, like cutting. I mean, like I've like cutting the amount of money you spend on school lunches while increasing the amount of money you spend on cops because you want to send police officers to schools. It's like, okay, but like, what if we like fed the children instead of arrested them? It's just prioritization, and it's just like a sense of like what actually helps people. And I think that we're very used to and very comfortable with the idea that punitive measures help people, specifically like sort of what we're saying before about like removal. We just need to like remove all the bad people in society will improve, and like that's never worked. It doesn't work. We've been trying it for a long time. It's still not working. You know, like let's do things differently.
Completely. And thinking about doing things differently, I was wondering how you thought the Biden administration might cause
Mm,
us to do policing a bit differently in the U.S. or maybe not. Like, what do you think the
mm.
impact of the election will be?
Yeah, I mean, if there's one thing we've seen, it's that fairly moderate leftist positions can easily be recast as being like radical. And so just something as simple as like accountability bills or even just like mandating, misconduct data was being seen as like shockingly leftist. So I think we're going to see the administration be just as like moderate right of center as it possibly can. But the other side of that is that police reform is not unpopular among police officers. You can find people who support this community, who support some type of reform. I was actually looking at this interview with the former head of police in Dallas. He was talking about they have a real problem with calls of service. So like in Dallas, when you call 911, it goes to police almost all the time. And so can you imagine a police department being stretched so thin for something like like we had like there's a problem with stray dogs, and like that'll get routed to like 911. So like you have police officers who are saying we're overtaxed, we need to do something else, we need to like rework this the way we do calls for service. That sounds like very like overlapping with just like reforming. Well, what happens when you call 911? What if something else happened anyway? So there are types of reforms I think that can be made that will be lauded by different police unions or police organizations, and I think that's what Biden will gravitate towards. I think that that's unfortunate though, because even the fact that we're doing those minimal changes is purely because people that were much more radical, like pushing and pushing and pushing and demanding, and we get like this like minimal change. And so the people who are going to be blamed for being too radical are the only reason we're going to see any change whatsoever, and all the credit is going to go for people who want the most like incremental like minor changes. Generally something is better than nothing, but I think we're going to see a lot of grassroots organizers doing a lot of labor, and whatever gets done will be attributed to the people who oppose them, who like held them back in the first place, and then we'll just keep hearing those leftists are too left over and over again.
Well, I mean, I know there are police unions that are more sane than the ones we have in New York, but the thought of like the Sergeant Benevolence Association or even Pat Lynch controlling the federal policing agenda is slightly nauseating. But
Yeah, 100%.
so let me just remind everyone again, if you could add any questions you have in the Q&A button at the bottom, that would be fabulous. We already have a bunch, but want to get as many as possible. And then just before we get to the Q&A, I want to ask, how do you see the linkage between, Camden's use of surveillance and just the broader push towards gentrification?
Yeah, I was just reading this book from Brian Jefferson's Digitize and Punish, which I think came out over the summer. I don't remember the exact date, but it was basically a large connection between gentrification and police surveillance. And that when you look at Camden, when you look at Baltimore, when you look at Boston, look at Chicago, you're looking at cities that were like facing a lot of deindustrialization. Like they were doing very well decades ago. Then because of outsourcing automation, a huge loss of factory jobs, we saw these economies tank. We saw a huge increase in like crime and things like that. And we also saw the need to quote unquote remove people via, arresting them, and like the way that surveillance will help with that project. So I think the two things are like very much connected. When you think about cities that are undergoing rapid gentrification are the ones that are the most strapped for resources and the ones that are like most interested in these cost saving measures. And so surveillance is always being presented as a cost saving measure, and that it will reduce labor for police officers and it'll reduce crime and the money being spent on it. So I think that like in Baltimore, for example, they just tested an aerial surveillance unit. It was called AIR, and it's literally a spy plane. And the company that created it is also shopping it in St. Louis. So they're going after not just high crime places, but places that are high crime where there's a dire need for resources. And so the way that capitalism is like so malleable, or that these capitalist responses are so malleable, I think when I adopt a perspective of these startups that are trying to like push the surveillance scare, they're going to go for the places where there's a lot of, not just where there's like a lot of like a need to reduce people, but like gentrification is so like tantalizing for leadership because it's like, oh, we're going to get rid of the bad people and bring in the good people. We're going to spend lots of money. Like it's so desirous to them. And so the specific like draws of gentrification, I think are so compatible with this idea that you can cheaply remove people. That's the most like bluntly way I can like explain surveillance technology, is that you can like cheaply remove people, which is sort of like what gentrification engenders. And so cities that were like formerly industrial, but now they're coming back and they're putting up these lovely lofts, and everything's gonna be green and like all this stuff, like that's sort of like ripe for these surveillance style responses because of the way that they're marketed and the rhetoric that surrounds them, which is why you see them in places like Baltimore and Boston, Chicago, which are undergoing tons of gentrification, New York as well.
Completely. Yes, completely agree. All right, turning to some of the audience questions, Chris asked, with the vast majority of law enforcement focusing on street crime, are there stats on how much they spend regarding white-collar crime?
I'm not aware of any, but I would love to know. And I would just say that I think it was ProPublica put out, you have PredPol, which is this predictive policing, where it's like this idea that you can use algorithms to predict crime. They did PredPol for white collar crime. And it was, I think, like the hottest spot in the country was Wall Street. And I just like love that so much. Is a very accurate thought exercise. But, the point being that the idea that surveillance technology is crime prevention, it's like, well, what type of crime are you trying to prevent or go after? And it's not even the crime that costs the most money. It's, violent crime, it's petty crime, it's brown crime, it's not white collar crime.
Yeah, and like full disclosure, in my corporate days, I was defending companies accused of white collar crime, particularly criminal antitrust violations. And I can assure you, it is tiny, the number of people who are prosecuted in any given year for insider trading related crimes, or money laundering or things like that, versus relatively low level drug offenses. And there's also a really sad reality that prosecutors assume that they can prosecute someone who is poor, so a defendant of color, with much less evidence than it takes to arrest a hedge fund trader, even if he technically is on the hook for a much more serious crime.
And if the concern is finances, it doesn't make any financial sense to just not go after these people that are stealing so much money. Like the issue is money, go after the people who are stealing just huge amounts of money, not the people who have like $300 in, whatever substance. It just doesn't make sense.
Oh, yeah. And also, one thing people should know is routinely the criminal penalties in these large white collar cases, they're in the billions. And that's all money that goes to the US Treasury. And so, this is something that if we were enforcing it more often, it would not be a burden to the government. It would be a boon. But of course, it would not be politically popular. Um, all right, so please keep the questions coming. Next, we are asked, did you have any immediate reaction to today's Facebook lawsuits from the FTC and 46 attorneys general, or 48 attorneys general?
I didn't have an immediate reaction to that. I mean, Facebook's legal team is sort of like, the end of Avengers Infinity War, where like they all come out and then like, storm the world. Like, Facebook certainly knows how to defend itself. Facebook has also had a lot of time to familiarize itself with these arguments, with the key players. Facebook also is fully aware that there's a real paucity of education among our leaders. You watch those hearings where people are like, does Facebook sell ads? So like they have the benefit of just basic knowledge. So I think if anything, we're at the beginning of what's going to be a very long process, and we're going to get a lot of blog posts from Zuck about the importance of connecting people, and not the types of changes that that we would all love to see. I mean, Facebook. Where to even begin with that one? But it's like there's a laundry list of different harms that don't seem to be being addressed at all. And just, the bar could not just be lower. I guess my immediate reaction, like the bar is so low for Facebook and they just keep finding ways to, but that's my reaction.
I mean, and not to mention they're the largest big tech lobbyist in DC. They gave, millions and millions of dollars to local election officials. It's part of the 2020 election. Like, they're spending so much money in one way or another just to try to rehabilitate their image. Because it's clear that we never would have gotten this sort of lawsuit if not for the fact that Facebook and Zuckerberg are both so reviled.
Oh man, there's just, I mean, yes, absolutely. But at the same time, it's like, it just doesn't feel sticky. Like there was just this weird, actually not that dissimilar from Trump, where it was like, there was just so much bad news that it all sort of like evened out, and where it was like hard to differentiate, which bad Facebook thing is happening right now. And so they just sort of like netted out just by virtue of like so much bad happening at once. It's like, which thing are we talking about? Misinformation? Are we talking about so it's like, it's sort of like, I don't know, just like because the news cycle goes so fast now, they sort of like were able to like wait it out in a way that's like terrifying, but hopefully this will be a lot more sticky.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wonder about that because that's something I've noticed as well, and I wonder to what extent that sort of reflects the fact that there's just so much terrible news about the platform, and to what extent it reflects the fact that they are a monopoly and that it's sort of people accept them as being terrible simply because they are viewed as irreplaceable and for these very specific facets of our life.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of goes to just sort of like, it is very hard to live without, some of the most reviled companies. It's just very difficult. Like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Uber, like if you were to just cut all that stuff out of a person's life, like it would be extraordinarily difficult for them to go about their day. That being so, it sort of like traps us all like work within, like we have to remain users while also like rebelling against all the changes it makes for users. So it just, I don't know, modern living just requires such such like ongoing deafening dissonance in terms of like being trapped in the techno dystopian net, but also trying to change it. And it's like, make the trap a little bit better. Don't get rid of the trap, but like just make it a little bit, softer. So, it's weird because it's like, I go back and forth between like, just burn it all down, get rid of technology, I'm done. And then just like, okay, well, like a little bit, like loosening the noose a little bit, but yeah.
Yeah, and the irony also being that we are on these terrible tech platforms as we talk about how terrible they are, and they've become even more indispensable in the age of COVID. So the next question comes from Juan, who asks, is there a recommendation for how to calculate an appropriate amount to spend on public safety? Is there a community out there that you think is getting it right?
I don't know a community out there that's getting it perfect, but I will say in my reporting, talking to people that do municipal budgets, there are specific fallacies that they recommend you look out for. Number one is police budgets generally rise regardless of recession. So even whether public safety stays the same, whether crime goes up, whether crime goes down, we tend to spend more on these budgets, or they remain stable. And so when you think about that, it's like crime is down, so we need to spend more on policing in order to keep crime down. Or like crime is up, we're not spending enough on policing. Well, let's increase crime. Well, crime remains the same. So it's like we need to stay on top of what it is that we're specifically trying to solve. And so some budgets require performance metrics, which is this idea that like this is how much we spent, and this is like an example of a performance metric would be like a clearance rate. So it's like, let's say X city spent this much money investigating violent crimes. What percent of those crimes was there an arrested suspect? So that number tends to be pretty low, like 25 or 30%. And so I think the number one thing to do is actually not just look at these budgets, but like how well are they doing and what are the standards, and also making sure the metrics aren't vague. Like you would want a metrics that's like, reduce car break-ins by 18% is a good metric, but something like increased public safety, you know what I mean? Like, what does that mean? That could be anything. So I think like the number one thing I would say is like, you just have to be very specific about what it is that you want to hold to account when you're like looking at what a good balance is. But I mean, you just have to make so many concessions, because what I consider to be a good police budget would be completely different from, the next, even within my own household, we would all come up with like very different answers. So I think like, it's going to require like way more compromise than anyone is going to be happy with. But there are certain things that I think everyone can look at, which is like, okay, well, like, let's make sure we have a specific number for how much money we're spending on this stuff, and we actually know how good of a job that they're doing. And I think everyone would agree on like just that at like a base for where to begin, just like that basic transparency, even if the numbers are going to shift, a lot.
Yeah, and the one thing I would just add is that we should definitely be looking, outside our borders for guidance on this, because, there are so many communities outside the United States where we've seen really effective social investment and safety net programming, very minimal investment in policing and mass incarceration, and comparable, if not better, public safety. So I do think that these are things where we shouldn't just have that U.S. Perspective. So we'll have a time for a couple more questions. So feel free to add more if you want to the Q&A thing at the bottom. Next, we're asked, what do you think of the use of surveillance tools like body cams to effectively counter surveil the police, and balancing that against the inevitable public price of it? So this, I think, is referencing recent stories about protesters using facial recognition to identify police officers who were covering their badge numbers, which I think took place in Portland.
I think that's a fantastic question. And actually, going back to what you were saying about looking outside our borders, France was actually voting on a bill that would make it to where you couldn't post pictures of police officers because it's threatening. You couldn't post a picture of a police officer online because it's threatening them. And that's just like staggering to me, but it seems like a total wet dream for a lot of people here in America. But, to respond to that question, I would say I had a wonderful conversation with Simone Brown, who's at UT Austin. She wrote a wonderful book, Dark Matters, which is genius, and everybody should read it. But I think that the main issue is that whatever counter surveillance recourse you use, there is going to be some type of price to pay, and it may not be you who pays it. It may be people you don't know, maybe all of us, it can go a lot of different ways. And so I really think about, like with George Floyd, for example, that started with a viral video. And so when I spoke to Dr. Brown, we talked about this sort of like double policing with that type of response. So on the one hand, like it's a video of a police officer acting like an asshole. And so there's like a certain degree of policing, but then you want it to go viral, so you upload it to these platforms. And there's another type of policing in terms of like content moderation, in terms of like the way those algorithms engage with what you've uploaded, and the fact that it can be manipulated and changed in all these different ways. And so, like it's policed in the sense of like what Facebook cares about is optimizing for attention and shares. And so you may upload something to be like, hey, look at this horrible thing. Isn't this sad and disgusting? Isn't this outrageous? And then it gets amplified as just like the new viral clip to be memed and edited. And it's the same thing with YouTube with these clips, like people create like, like these like jokey memes, even though what they're looking at is disgusting. So it's like, if the goal is to humanize the person being dehumanized by police, it's hard to control that when you put something out in the world and the algorithms essentially dress it up and stage mom it out and turn it into something else. But then that could also be a good thing, like with the "you about to use their job" meme, which is like hilarious. And a lot of people were shouting that when they called for Biden. Like, that was fun, but it's like, it's an image, it's a video of, another, atrocity essentially that gets manipulated, turned around. And then luckily we ended up humanizing the woman and not the officer. And so I would just say, do it. Like if obviously if you see police misconduct and like you're like in a safe position, and like a lot of people who record misconduct videos end up being arrested and in more trouble than the officer doing the misconduct, which is like the most American thing ever. But like, I think that it is very much possible to use technology, but at the same time, we always have to mediate it through like Facebook or Instagram or YouTube, whereas like police officers get to like use their footage and mediate it through the courts, and they get to, like for example, a lot of police departments, the police officer gets to see the body camera footage before they write their report. So it's like they get to directly author the footage and how it's used and how it's interpreted, and whereas we have to go through these third parties that don't really have our back. So it's like there's a power skew when we do that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I always find appealing about these, civilian surveillance campaigns and flipping the camera around is the fact that, with body cams, with dash cams, with any of the municipal surveillance architecture, you are giving the power to the police chief to decide who gets to see what when. And like sometimes you can sue them, sometimes you can get the data, but most of the time, if it's favorable information for the cop, it comes out instantly. But if it's unfavorable, it takes years of litigation to actually see what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think that's tantalizing. But one thing I wanted to add as a word of caution is, if you're a bystander and you're, except for in extraordinary cases where someone dies, it's really on you to get consent, right? Because maybe you're capturing images that person wants shared, but maybe not. And I feel like there's so much importance in like giving them that option and that control of their own narrative.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, absolutely.
All right, so we have just 2 minutes left for one last question, and it is a doozy. Looking at the way that the surveillance state has expanded under COVID, do you think there's a way back? Can we undo the sort of COVID-related surveillance state that's grown during the pandemic?
Is there a way back? I mean, hopefully, like we just got the news of, the new vaccines. I would say that first and foremost, people should stay safe and be monitoring themselves as possible. I would say, secondly, a lot of the people that you see out doing things are not doing it by choice. Like we have a lot of people that have to go to work, that have to provide. And so I think you end up with this weird situation where I'm worried about these surveillance tools being used against people who are just, work at a grocery store or they're a healthcare worker or whatever. So I think we're going to see a lot of that surveillance stuff pointing at people like that and not the people who are going to parties and raves, things like that. Like there's always, pointing the wrong direction. But in terms of the way back from that, I don't know. I only have 2 minutes to answer this question. I haven't spent as much time thinking about it as I'd like to, but I hope that we're setting the ground for, walking it back once the time comes.
I think that is the perfect note to end our last RadTech meetup of the year. Hope. because we all know this has been a hell of a year on the policing front, on the surveillance front, on the COVID front, and just obviously we all know so many people who haven't made it through. So I think hope is the perfect note that 2021 gets here pretty damn soon and puts an end to all of the terrible things that have unfolded this year. But Sidney, thank
Absolutely.
you again for joining
Uh,
us. Thank you so much for all of your amazing writing on this topic. And thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back in January with our next installment. And until then, please stay home, stay safe, and happy holidays.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.